Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're doing something a little different. We're going to reverse engineer Chapter 8 of Niccolò Machiavelli's classic text, The Prince. But look, we aren't going to treat this like some dusty piece of 16th century history. Instead, we're unpacking the hidden physics of a shock-and-awe hostile takeover. Because whether you're looking at a ruthless corporate raid, a massive cyber attack, or a sudden political coup, the actual mechanics of seizing power quickly and brutally, they all follow the exact same structural blueprint.
So, here's our game plan for decoding this 500-year-old manual. We're going to move through 6 key beats: the shock of acquisition, the psychology of terror, the fear equilibrium, how fear-based systems fail, modern cross-domain transfers, and finally, Machiavelli's master flaw.
All right, diving right into Section 1, the shock of acquisition, or how to bypass the rules entirely.
There is just a massive, fundamental difference between true authority and forced compliance. A legitimacy equilibrium is like a deeply rooted tree. It takes a long time to grow through mutual consent, but man, is it stable. But what Machiavelli is mapping out is a fear equilibrium. This is control built purely on coercion. You get instant acquisition, sure, but it is incredibly fragile.
Because here's the harsh underlying reality: crime creates compliance, not authority. When a usurper completely bypasses the rules to get to the top, they haven't actually earned any authority. They've just forced people to comply. And a system built on compliance rather than genuine authority, well, that has to be continuously, exhaustingly propped up by sheer force.
That brings us to Section 2, the psychology of terror, the actual engine of submission.
So why does this brutally fast acquisition temporarily work on a population? It all comes down to a concept called learned helplessness at scale. People under these types of regimes aren't suddenly feeling fiercely loyal to a new leader, not at all. They are purely optimizing for survival. They learn to adapt by completely dropping any expectation of resistance just to avoid triggering the regime's punishment systems.
A successful usurper relies on 2 very specific psychological levers to make this happen. First up is the shock compression effect. The sudden, overwhelming nature of the takeover literally shatters the population's capacity to coordinate. They're just too stunned to organize. Then you have fear memory anchoring. That initial extreme burst of brutality sets the behavioral boundaries for the long haul. The ultimate goal here is to compress a unified population into fragmented, isolated little nodes of compliance.
Moving to Section 3, the fear equilibrium. Let's see how they balance this crazy machine.
This fragile grip relies on a positive control loop. Think of it as a sequence. You apply violence, which generates fear, which enforces compliance, which ultimately gives you temporary stability. This behavioral suppression works instantly, which is exactly why usurpers love it. But keeping this loop running day after day is just incredibly expensive and resource-heavy.
Now, if you push this machine just a bit too hard, you trigger a negative stability loop. If a regime uses excessive, unnecessary cruelty, it stops generating just fear and starts generating deep, boiling resentment. And that resentment? It forces the elites and the general population underground, where they start covertly coordinating. Suddenly, your rebellion risk spikes right off the charts. It truly boils down to this brutal mathematical reality. The entire system survives strictly as long as the cost of keeping the population terrified remains lower than the population's ability to coordinate a rebellion. The very second that equation flips, the ruler is done for.
Which leads us perfectly into Section 4, how fear-based systems fail, and what that breaking point looks like.
We know the maintenance is mathematically unsustainable forever, so how does it shatter? Well, if the usurper's coercion intensity drops even slightly below the threshold needed to inspire fear, the spell is broken. The regime enters total collapse the moment collective resistance overtakes the enforcement capacity. This usually kicks off when underground networks finally form, external actors step in to help, or powerful new ideological narratives emerge to unite the oppressed. To stop this from happening, usurpers have to rely on really desperate counter-strategies, like randomly rotating the intensity of their enforcers or strictly suffocating the flow of information, because it all serves one absolute singular goal. Fear has to stay individualized. It can never, ever be allowed to synchronize. The moment the oppressed realize they actually outnumber the enforcers, the game is over. All right, Section 5, Modern Cross-Domain Transfers. Let's bring Machiavelli into the modern era. This is where it gets really fascinating. If we look across totally different modern domains, the same physics of shock entry followed by rapid stabilization is literally everywhere.
Take high-risk trading. An aggressive, leveraged entry works perfectly during a market panic, but it completely fails the moment liquidity participants coordinate against it. Or look at cybersecurity. An exploit-based takeover grants you instant access, but it collapses the second patching and detection networks activate. The mechanics of Machiavelli's usurper are playing out in our servers and our stock markets every single day.
Seeing just how remarkably effective this blueprint is across all these different areas brings us to the ultimate question. Can a system built entirely on the shock of acquisition and sustained only by fear actually last indefinitely?
And that brings us to our final part, Section 6, Machiavelli's master flaw and his biggest blind spots.
Machiavelli was undeniably a genius of his era, but his model contains a massive flaw when you apply it today. He basically assumed fear was a stable, permanent governance mechanism. He totally failed to anticipate a hyper-interconnected world where information diffuses instantly through social media, allowing resistance to scale in minutes. He also suffered heavily from survivorship bias. He focused entirely on the brutal takeovers that worked, while completely ignoring the long-term collapse patterns of all the ones that failed.
Because here is the modern reality. Fear is not a stable foundation. It's a decaying signal. It decays unless it is continuously, exhaustingly reinforced. But in modern networked systems, overusing coercion doesn't just maintain your baseline of control. It actually accelerates the very resistance that will eventually destroy you.
Ultimately, removing legitimate governance leaves a massive vacuum, and you either fill that with continuous, exhausting coercion or the system collapses. Shock creates control, for sure, but only systems that convert that shock into genuine structure are going to survive. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want you to think about this. Where do you see this decaying fear equilibrium playing out right now in your own industry or organization? Because whether we're talking about a corporate boardroom or a nation-state, sheer coercion is never a long-term strategy. It's literally just a countdown to systemic collapse.